go ahead and start again, and then I think. So I need a microphone.
Just a motion, is that what it is? To open, or I open the July 31, 2019 Town of Haymarket Architectural Review Board training. Roll call, please.
Schneider.
Here.
Cabrera-Rosick. Here. Edwards. Here. Shannon.
Here.
Cavazos. Here. Corral.
Here.
Leak.
Here.
Leak.
Here.
Okay.
All right.
Great. So if I may begin, I'm here to do a little bit more training, to kind of build on the training that we did last year. I have some handouts in front of you. These all come from the Albemarle County Land Use Law Handbook, which is a great resource that you can find on the Albemarle County website. A long list of chapters and appendices that I've attached for you. One is specifically Chapter 21, Design Review, Selected Issues for an Architectural Review Board, which collects a number of helpful cases and some information about adoption of guidelines and the process for doing architectural review. Second one is Appendix C, which is the shorter of two chapters on FOIA. This one's specifically on meetings and is short enough to be quickly digested. And then lastly, Appendix G of strategies for making a decision, which I thought was just a useful overview for what's the process that we're going through. And so I'm going to tie those in as we go along. I'm happy to take questions at any time, so just please jump right in, but please remember we are being recorded, so if you grab a mic when you do that, that would be great. So let's go and do a recap of last December's training. So that was ARB. I don't remember who else was here, but we talked about the things that you see on the slide there. Specifically, the Virginia Constitution has a provision relatively new that says property is a fundamental right. And of course, the right of property includes a number of things, such as the right to possess, use, and enjoy property, and to destroy, exclude others, and to sell it. So when you look at state laws that restrict the use or restrict the ability of people to destroy or sell their property, those are always going to be measured against the fact that the fundamental right of property in Virginia assumes that you have those rights, and so the limitation is going to have to be justified in relation to the governmental purpose that you were engaged in. Otherwise, it could be considered an unlawful taking. We also talked about state statutes. There were not that many helpful definitions. There's a definition of historic area, but not of historic landmark or some of these other terms that we use. There are three ways to demolish a building in a historic district. You may recall that you can get a certificate of appropriateness. You can market the property at its fair market value to somebody who will preserve it for a period of 1 year or more, and if nobody buys it, then you get to destroy it by right. And the third way is if the building official condemns it pursuant to the property maintenance code.
Martin, I do have a question on the last one.
Yeah.
So when a building is condemned, it doesn't necessarily mean the only remedy is demolition, right? There's a degree. So let's say you condemn a building, but the remedy is boarding it up or securing it. It doesn't necessarily mean that the only remedy or the immediate remedy is demolition, right?
I'm speaking loosely when I say condemning it, because you're right. There are there's a specific provision in the state code that requires that the building official make a finding that determines that it constitutes such a hazard that it shall be razed, demolished, or moved. So that's not simply being uninhabitable, which is what we usually think of when we say condemned. This is actually another level of that, which is this is a hazard that needs to come down soon.
All of the remedies have been exhausted. The only reasonable means to address it is demolition.
Well, right. And
one way to interpret it.
Well, you know, so if it's a hazard that it needs to be razed, demolished, or moved, that implies that there are no other ways to save it as a structure at that point. Right.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah. And then we talked a little bit about Robert's Rules of Order and all of that good stuff because, and I think I mentioned to you the EZA case out of Fairfax, which I think is still going on, where Fairfax BZA reconsidered something, and the court said, no, you can't do that actually because your rule said you would only reconsider it within a certain period of time. So obviously the best course of action is if your rules say that you will do something within a particular period of time, then you should do that within that particular period of time. And if you're thinking about extending that, then that needs to be something that we have a legal discussion about. Can we have the next slide? So today I'm going to cover 4 topics. How to follow FOIA requirements for open meetings. So we're going to get into that. What is an open meeting? What does it require? And we're going to talk about how to create a record to support the ARB's decision. So essentially, what the ARB is doing is reaching a conclusion based on the facts that are presented to it and the facts that are known to the members of the ARB that allow it to typically support a certificate of appropriateness or not support a certificate of appropriateness. Obviously, there are other things that the ARB does in terms of providing reports and information, but we're mostly talking about creating a record for a decision with regard to a specific property that will then guide what happens with that property. Then connected to that, we're going to talk about how to avoid problems in the record, the kinds of problems that create legal headaches for the town. And then finally, how to make decisions based on a good process. That ties back into the third handout that I gave you on making good decisions. Go to the next slide. So let's touch on open meeting requirements first. So what is a meeting? A meeting is a gathering of a quorum or 3 or more, even if that's not a quorum, of members of a public body where there's discussion about public business. So that's kind of a mouthful. The things to remember are that if you have a committee, that is a public body as well. So if you have a committee of 3, a quorum of that is 2. And when 2 people on the committee get together to talk about the committee business, that's a meeting, and it has to be advertised, and you have to take minutes. And it has to be open to the public. I thought you had a question. You just scratched your head.
No, I just scratched my head.
So a meeting can occur kind of spontaneously. There are specific rules for if you're at a social gathering and there's no intent to get together to discuss business, then that's the language of the statute says that doesn't constitute a meeting. But you shouldn't talk about public business anyway. If you're going to talk about public business, there's a couple of ways to do that. You can call a meeting. You can do that one-on-one, one member talking to another member. And you can use email. But let me suggest you not use email. Email creates a record, which can be FOIA'd. If you use your personal device to send email relating to public business, then that is subject to FOIA, even if it's on your personal device, so you don't want to do that. And so there are a number, and the worst problem is if you are emailing back and forth fast enough that you would be similar to in-person conversation, it's going to constitute a meeting. We haven't seen a court case yet where the courts found that had occurred, but we can't say that there's a bright line. We can't say, well, an email every 5 minutes is fine, but any more often than that, it becomes a meeting. We don't know where that line is, and so the best course of action is to avoid using email as much as possible. And don't get me started about text messages. They're even worse because they're a pain to try to get off your device to do a FOIA request response. Let me drop down on the left-hand column sticking there. Who can record a meeting? Any person can record a meeting. Any member of the public can record the open portions of the meeting. There's a FOIA advisory opinion dealing with somebody who wanted to put their microphone on the dais, and the local governing body wouldn't let them do that. And they said, well, how am I? If I'm recording from further away, it won't be good sound quality. And what FOIA Advisory Council said was, you're entitled to record the meeting. The recording needs to be audible, but it doesn't have to be the best sound quality that's humanly possible. So the body that is having the meeting can have rules about where the microphone is going to be placed, so long as people can actually make an audible recording of the meeting. This opinion goes also on to talk about a couple of other things that I'll mention a little bit later. But remember that recording of the meeting can be all of the open portions, including recesses, stuff that happens before the meeting starts, stuff that happens after the meeting ends. And so they're allowed to be in that room. It's a public room until it's closed out, and they can record what's going on. So even if you are not recording here on the town's equipment, somebody else could be recording on their equipment because they're entitled to record the open portions of the meeting. So that kind of dovetailed into the top right thing there. What is permitted before meeting starts, during a break, or after adjournment? Outside the formal boundaries of a meeting, you shouldn't have discussions. Members shouldn't have discussions by or with a quorum of the body. So let me say what that means. A discussion by a quorum of the body would be if you assume that 3 is a quorum of the body. 3 of you can't be having a discussion before the meeting starts, during a break, or after the meeting ends about public business. And you also, so that's the discussion by the 3 members. You also can't have a discussion with a quorum of the body. So Emily couldn't talk to 3 members of the ARB, even if they're not doing any talking themselves, just listening. If she's talking to them about public business outside the confines of a meeting, that is before the meeting starts, during a break, or after the meeting ends, that's going to be a FOIA violation because you are having a meeting at that point. So that's why it's important to have private discussions remain one-on-one if you are going to have those, and have the people step away from the dais. You're going to have, you want to get out of microphone range if you want to have the confidentiality of the meeting of that sidebar conversation protected, and you need to avoid involving other members of the public body, either listening or participating in that conversation. So the best idea is if you have something that you can lawfully discuss in closed session, call a closed session and have that discussion there. If you do some pre-planning, then there are a lot of different ways to go into closed session. Yes, ma'am.
Is that true for just the council, or can the other boards go into closed session?
The other boards can go into closed session as well.
Thank you.
So that's a matter that we have a form that you all can use to make the motion to enter closed session. The motion to closed session, just remember, has 3 elements. You have to cite the specific code section. So you say 2.23711A1, for example. You have to say what the subject matter of the meeting is, to discuss personnel performance, for example. And then you have to say what the purpose of the meeting is, and the purpose is to discuss that in the context, for example, of hiring a business manager. So that would be the 3 elements put together: the code section, the subject, and the purpose.
Martin, I do have a question about that. So
Yeah.
right now, Emily, just want to confirm our protocol. If we need the lawyers or attorneys help to form a closed session motion, what is the protocol to go through you to contact the attorney?
That probably makes sense. I mean, the communication policy that the town has adopted says that the mayor or vice mayor can contact the attorney.
Okay.
And so if you contacted Emily as the staff liaison, she would clear it through the mayor or vice mayor and come to me.
Okay, thanks.
And let me go on then to the 4th point there. When are sidebar conversations allowed? They are allowed just like any other conversations outside the confines of the meeting. That is, you can have them. You can't involve other members of the same public body, but you can take the time to go far enough away that you are actually having a private conversation and not involve other members of the body. If members of the public want to come up and talk to you during the meeting as a sidebar conversation, again, I think that's probably best handled by moving off the dais and into some private location so that you can have that conversation. And that can be socially awkward to kind of shoo people away. I did a little bit about that before the meeting started. Say it's fine to talk about movies. It's fine to talk about sports. Your old teachers, the weather, whatever it is you want to talk about, but don't talk about public business in periods of time that are outside the open portions of the open meeting that are actually meeting. Okay.
Martin, do applicants include that as well? So members of the public,
Yeah.
applicants, whomever, it's just the recommendation is off the dais, sidebar, reasonable.
Right. And then the question always comes to my mind is, why do we need to have this conversation privately? And we'll get into some of this about what is the information set that you are relying on when you as the ARB or the council acts as a body. And that's an important part of pulling this all together, which we'll get into in another slide. Let me just point out a couple things about what happens, what are the consequences if you have a meeting without following the proper protocol. In 2009, the Attorney General issued a pair of opinions that, Attorney General of Virginia, that is, issued a pair of opinions that says that if you have a meeting without giving proper notice as required by the statute, that meeting is invalid. In that case, what had happened was that there was insufficient notice for a meeting of the governing body, and they appointed a school board member at that body's meeting. And the question was that a valid appointment? The Attorney General's opinion was no. It was not a valid appointment because the statute says that you can only meet as provided for by law. And under FOIA, a meeting requires a certain amount of notice. 3 days notice for a regular meeting, and notice that is reasonable under the circumstances and contemporaneous to the public as well as to the members of the body for a special or emergency meeting. So without the notice provision, you don't have a valid meeting. Then the question becomes, well, what happens if you otherwise violate FOIA? Does that implicate the validity of actions taken at that meeting? And the answer is we don't know. That was one of the charges that was brought, well, one of the accusations that was made with regard to the Fairfax County School Board in a meeting involving the Clifton Elementary School, where the plaintiffs who attacked the decision of the school board to close that school said, well, you had an illegal meeting and therefore the decision you reached was invalid. The courts found that the exchange of text messages by the school board members at the dais did not constitute an illegal meeting, so they didn't have to decide whether holding that illegal meeting simultaneously with their open meeting would have invalidated the action they took. The argument was, you're up there looking like you're having a real meeting because you're talking and you're in the same room, but really you're having a secret meeting by text message and email. And so that was the argument that was made. We don't know whether in another case that argument would prevail or not, but better not to find out. All right. Yes, ma'am.
So, for the purposes of the town,
Yeah.
whenever a meeting is called to the time that we adjourn, the microphones needs to be on all the time?
No, you can turn off the mic during a recess, but you shouldn't be having conversations about public business matters during that recess unless they are a sidebar like I was describing, where you're walking away from the microphone and you're having a conversation in private. Otherwise, you're all together up there, people can hear what's going on, and you have the potential of creating an illegal meeting at that point. Okay? So now I'm going to turn to the second topic, the creation of a record to support the ARB's decision. So obviously, members of the ARB bring their particular experience and expertise to bear on the handling the matters that are placed before the ARB. And the purpose of that is to serve the public interest. Council depends on the ARB using its experience and expertise to create a record that supports its position. So this is where the handbook chapter on ARBs that I handed out comes into play, and you find that to be useful. It goes into some detail about the first point on this slide, the legal standard for court review. I could swear I made that text bigger. Anyway, so what is the ARB doing? Is it legislative, administrative? Is it judicial? It's kind of got elements of all of these things, because like a jury, you're hearing evidence and making a decision. But like a legislature, you can also go out and gather your own evidence, which a jury can't do. And you can then take that evidence that you've gathered and share that with the rest of the ARB and say, I found this information, and therefore I want you to take that into consideration because that's relevant to the issues that are before us. And what the courts have said, based on what the statutory language there is that it's basically a legislative decision of the ARB to determine whether to approve a certificate of appropriateness. And so what does it mean to be a legislative decision? It means what it says up there in the first bullet point. The action of the ARB will be upheld unless contrary to law, arbitrary, or an abuse of discretion. And that's a very relaxed standard. The courts basically have a very deferential attitude towards the final decision on a demolition decision because they say, well, that is a matter that the statutes have granted to our architectural review boards in the first instance and to city councils and town councils and county boards of supervisors at the appellate level. And so we're not going to disturb that unless it is contrary to law, arbitrary, and abuse of discretion. So they're going to have to look for something very seriously wrong with your decision and to overturn it. And this has also been referred to as the fairly debatable standard, which we know from general zoning law that applies to every legislative decision. If the town council zones one parcel A1 and the next parcel over to is I1, as long as there is some basis for the decision that makes it fairly debatable, where, well, reasonable minds could differ, then the court's going to uphold that. The court's not going to substitute its judgment for the judgment of the legislative body. So what happens with the fairly debatable standard, and this came up in Norton versus City Danville, the case I've cited to here, is that the challenger, in this case property owner, has to come in and show that the decision of the locality is irrational, and that it's contrary to law, it's arbitrary and abuse of discretion. Then it's like a tennis game, the ball goes over the net, and the locality has the ability to strike it, send it back over the net. In this case, the city swung and missed because they had no evidence whatsoever that they produced to support their decision. And the court said, well, if you don't have any evidence, then you can't rebut this evidence of unreasonableness, and therefore we're going to rule for the challenger in this case. So that's the process. So that underscores the importance of creating a record. When the ARB makes a decision, your ordinance, town ordinance, requires that you make a record of the reasons for denying a COA, but you should make a record in every case. That's where the planner comes in very helpfully to produce a staff report, and the staff report is going to be really, in many cases, the underlying basis for your decision. However, the staff report needs to look at not just one side, but both sides. There's always, in these situations, there's going to be a weighing of interests. And if there's something about the property that weighs on the side of preserving it as opposed to demolishing it, then the staff report should indicate that this is, for example, an indicative of the style of houses that were built here in the 1920s, and there are fewer and fewer of those available on the market. And so that would be one way that would be one piece of evidence that supports not demolishing a building. So the Albemarle Handbook chapter on ARBs goes into some of this in terms of kind of the factors that you're looking for, and how to build that kind of record is you look at the factors and what how they weigh on both sides of the issue. So then, of course, before we get to court review, the first level of appeal is to the town council. And so what is the town council going to be reviewing? And there is no set standard. It's not like the legislative presumption of correctness or anything of that nature. It's simply whatever the council finds persuasive. So if you write if you have a good staff report, and then the ARB adds to that with whatever they bring to the table, then you're creating the best record to persuade the council to uphold the decision of the ARB. So under your ordinance, and I cite that in the first bullet point there, the COA application requires analysis of external architectural features which are subject to public view from a public street, way, or place in light of their architectural compatibility with the historic buildings in the district. So that's the first thing that you're looking for, architectural compatibility with the district. And so when you've looked at that, that's your guiding light. Then you can turn to Town Code Section 58-14.9, which lists a number of criteria, which go then into greater detail, a little bit zooming in on the specifics of that. And in the case of a building to be raised, the criteria in the ordinance say a primary consideration will be the extent to which its continued existence would tend to protect irreplaceable historic places and preserve the general historic atmosphere of the town. So that's two things. Protect irreplaceable historic places. Okay, so you need to identify what the historic place that's irreplaceable and being protected is. And the other thing is preserve the general historic atmosphere of the town. So to what extent would preserving this building protect the general historic atmosphere of the town? If not at all, because nobody ever sees it, then that's going to be a weak argument for preserving the building. If it's on this prominent corner, then obviously that its value in that term goes way up. And so it would be relevant to point out what the situation of that property is in light of that particular criterion. And then you also have adopted ARB guidelines. They're about 9 years old right now, and I understand that we're going to be bringing those to you at the August meeting for further review. I've worked on a draft with staff. But when you have ARB guidelines, this goes back to whether it's arbitrary or an abuse of discretion. Because if you have written guidelines that say this is what we expect and this is the kinds of things that we will approve in a certificate of appropriateness, then that undercuts any argument that you're being arbitrary or abusing your discretion, because you've already put it in writing. You've already said, we're going to approve you. Just to take color as an example, we have a list of approved colors. You can bring in other colors, but if you come in with one of these approved colors on our list, we will approve your color. This does a number of things besides just making your record stronger and making it more defensible in court, because it also helps the business community understand what it is that they're going to be able to do with the property and enables them to develop it much more efficiently. So let me stop there and ask you if there are any questions, because I just said a lot of words.
So, Martin, you and I had a discussion about ex parte communications. I think what we had generally had a consensus on was that it's generally not necessarily prohibited, but generally discouraged.
Yeah, well, let's go to the next slide because it's on that.
Okay.
I'll jump
I'm
to
sorry, can we go back?
number two then.
Actually, before we move back, can we go back to the next slide? So the ARB guidelines, is the comprehensive plan also considered a guide or a guide with which to make?
Sure, absolutely. The comprehensive guide is, as you say, a guide. It is, if you can point to something in the comprehensive plan that says something one way or the other, that is very persuasive evidence. And if you cite that in your staff report, then that undercuts any argument that you're being arbitrary, because you've pointed to something in an adopted comp plan that supports your position.
I've always heard the Council Review of Appeals as de novo. It sounds like from this is that de novo in the sense that they're listening to the same facts that were presented.
Right.
And then I guess from this, you also have discretion. It seems like it would be prudent to keep within the bounds of what the ARB looked at, but in this, what you're suggesting, there's other arguments that can be made.
Right. There's no limitation on the decisions of the council on appeal, the way that there is under 58-14.9 for the board.
Okay.
So it is free to look at whatever legislative type factors are important to it.
If there's new information from between the ARB decision and the council, does the council have the ability to send it back?
Yeah, absolutely. So the council's abilities, options on appeal are to affirm, to deny, that is uphold, to reverse it, or to remand it, or to postpone it. So there's at least those four options at any meeting. If there are conditions that are placed on, for example, the COA for demolition, then the council can alter those as well. So they have a range of possible options. I've seen cases go back down to the ARB, in part because there was insufficient record to support it. And that gives the ARB another bite at the apple. But the better thing to do is to take your first bite at the apple in terms of creating the record, and to say, well, this is the evidence that we have that supports the position that we have.
Sorry, a couple more questions. So 45 days, we're limited by 45 days.
Correct.
is there if the applicant agrees to extend that, is that allowed or generally frowned upon?
Well, the time limit is for the benefit of the applicants, so if they waive it, they're not going to be heard to complain that it was waived. In other words, yes, they can. The practical upshot of that is going to be that if they want to, I was just looking for that 45 days.
Yeah, that's why I brought up. I was looking through that provision.
Yeah,
It
it's
say usually I see unless extended by the applicant, but not being in there, I didn't know if we could still ask that or not.
What it says is, whenever the board shall approve or disapprove an application or fail to take within 45 days of its filing, I think that should be take action within 45 days of this filing, any aggrieved party shall have the right to appeal. So basically, they would be, I think what happened was it got cut off on the side of the paper there. What you would have would be somebody you'd want it in writing, signed by the applicant.
That would be prudent, yeah.
That they want this to delay, and then that would be perfectly reasonable.
Last question about the council. Is the council on the same timeline or no?
No.
Okay, thank you.
They are, just like any other action by council on a zoning matter, it has to be reasonable in their time frame. But reasonable is a flexible standard. It's going to depend on how complicated the facts are and what the purpose for the delay is.
Thank you.
All right, let's go on to the next slide then. So this is the topic on avoiding problems with the ARB record. So the flip side of what we were just talking about, building a positive record, is avoiding negative things. The first point I want to make is, and this is straight out of the Albemarle handbook that I handed out, focus on the relevant considerations. What are the factors that you are looking at? And so that will tell you what facts are relevant. Think of it as a classical logical syllogism. If X, then Y. And if all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So you're looking at your elements of the syllogism, and you're trying to say, okay, what are the relevant factors? Let me gather the information about that. So that then leads you to only deciding the question before you, because you only have the limited scope that the ARB has under its charge under the ordinances to make the decisions that it makes. You're not called upon to decide whether something is good economic sense. You're not called upon to decide whether something constitutes a good zoning practice outside the sphere of historic preservation. You're solely being asked to make a decision based on the appropriateness of the certificate of appropriateness. Second point, and this comes back to the ex parte communications, maintaining impartiality is really important because it can be used against you if there's evidence of impartiality. There are some cases not involving architectural review boards but other kinds of bodies where the courts looked at signs of bias on the part of the body. And in some cases, the courts have said, well, that was an invalid decision because you had bias that implicated the body. They're very reluctant to do that. Courts understand that people are human and that we all come to the table with our own impressions of the world, but it can get to that point. I'd point out that before 2015, there was no state law that prohibited boards of zoning appeals from engaging in ex parte communications. That law's only been on the books for 4 years. So before that, any applicant could lobby members of the Board of Zoning Appeals directly. Now there's a law that prohibits it. Currently, there's no law that prohibits the ex parte communications for other bodies, like the Architectural Review Board, but they should be avoided or brought to the whole board. If somebody, and I know you've done this in the past, if somebody comes to you outside the scope of a meeting and gives you information, you bring it to the body and say, okay, here's what I found out from the communication that I had with the applicant or the neighbor or whoever it happens to be. Third point, so gather all the information available, and I'm kind of summarizing what's in the Albemarle handbook here. You're looking for all the information that will address the relevant considerations. And sometimes you just don't have information. You might be able to gather it, you might not. But you do gather what you have. And then you candidly present that to the world and offer the applicant and other interested parties the opportunity to respond to the information you have. So, if there's information that you have that's not in the staff report, and it's not in the public presentations, then there's no reason why the ARB can't say, well, I've got this other information here. Does anybody have any response to that? So, you can give the applicant additional time beyond just their opening statement to respond to things, and that will head off a lot of problems if you do, because you'll know. They come up and say, yeah, that's true, but here's why I don't think you should count that. Or they might say, I don't know where you heard that. That's not the case. So giving people an opportunity to respond is very important, just like in a courtroom where you want to have everybody have the opportunity to give their full statement. You have to do it in an orderly fashion, but you do have the ability to call people up and have them give you more information later on in the meeting. And then lastly, question and test your working hypotheses. So if you have a working hypothesis that this is going to be terrible for the town, try to see it from the other way. It's sort of like the principle of falsifiability in science. In science, you can't say something is really a scientific fact unless it's an assertion that could be proven false by some set of facts that you could physically discover. Similarly, here you want to look at, well, what information could I gather that would make me think the other way? You want to have the, weigh this like a judge does and try to see what the factors are. That will help you hone your decision. If you still come down on the same side of the question after you've done that work, then you will have the benefit of having looked at it from the other side. You'll have the benefit of saying, well, I considered this argument, but then I rejected it for these reasons. I found that it didn't outweigh the issues that I'm based my decision on. So that's that. And let's put it all together. So the decision-making process, like I said, we all need to be working off the same information. What is the information? It's going to be the staff report. It's going to be the presentations by the public. It's going to be public comment. And it's going to be information that the ARB members have and then present to the rest of the ARB. So we're all working off the same information. If you have knowledge about that property or about properties of that type, then you should definitely bring that forward so everybody has the benefit of your specific information. And that also creates facts that are public. You're not basing this on private communications, which creates problems. You want to have all the facts be part of the public record that's going to create the public record that will then allow you to support your decision. And then we want to make sure we're all applying the correct principles to the facts. So principles are going to be, again, what's laid out in the statute, what's laid out in the ordinances, and what's laid out in your guidelines and the comp plan. What are we trying to accomplish here in terms of restricting people's property rights for the public good? We're going to want to make sure that we're doing that in a way that is thoughtful about balancing the interests that are at issue here. And then when we analyze these facts using the principles that we've decided are applicable, then it's going to lead us to conclusions which determine what the available options are. So if the conclusion is, I really don't have enough information, I'd like to know more about this before I can make a decision, then that was caution for asking for additional information to be brought to you. Of course, you do only have the 45 days unless the applicant extends that, but you have the ability to call a special meeting. You have the ability to continue the meeting, keep it open for another meeting until your time's up. And then the actions should reflect a considered choice from the available options. So if your options are to approve or deny or grant with conditions, then you're going to say, well, I moved that we deny because I looked at approval and here, based on the staff report and the reasons in the discussion, I find that to be not in the public interest, and I can't think of any good conditions that would preserve the public interest for this demolition, and therefore the only thing that's left is denial. That would be a process of reasoning this out that would create a record that would be persuasive to the town council and on appeal to the circuit court if we get to that. So, as I mentioned earlier, town code does require that the ARB give reasons for disapproval of a certificate of appropriateness, but you should give reasons for every decision. Even if you're approving it, you should at least say, based on the staff report, I move to approve. That way you've got a record of why you did it, And we are showing that in every case we are acting in a way that is not arbitrary, not capricious, not contrary to law.
So Martin, one question on that. So the
Yeah.
range of, most of our applications are sign permits,
Mm-hmm.
very kind of innocuous sorts of things.
Right.
Is it generally recommended that we make some sort of finding there when we
Yeah.
approve it?
Again, if there's a staff report on the sign application.
Oh, just refer back to the record.
Yeah, based on the staff report, I move approval.
Okay.
You know.
We agree with the contents of it, that aligns with it?
Right,
Okay.
yeah.
And same, I guess, with all these could apply. I know we're talking about demolition, but same with like these, we're getting ready to look at a lot of large buildings in town.
Right, so if you're
Um,
looking at a new construction
Yeah.
of a new building, then you're going to have a staff report, you're going to have some kind of basis for making a decision about approving the portions of the building that you're authorized to look at, which are the portions that are visible from the public right-of-way.
So that's generally referring back to the guidelines, like you said earlier, the
Right.
basis for which, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, your analysis needs to make clear the weight that you're giving to the facts and the principles of historic preservation on the one hand, and you're weighing that against the fundamental right to property on the other. And remember, the fundamental right to property is the right to use it, the right to destroy it, and the right to sell it. So if you're restricting those rights, you're going to want to know that you have something fairly weighty in your other hand that is allowing you to outweigh, at least temporarily, those property interests of the property owner. So let me also say in this context that, I've seen this happen not just here, so I'm not picking on you all, that you have properties that come in that have been neglected for a long time. And the tendency is to say, gosh, if this had just been fixed up 20 years ago, we wouldn't be in the situation we are now. A lot of times you have the same owner that's been owning the property for 20 years and nothing's happened with it, but sometimes you have a new owner. And the new owner didn't cause the decay of the building. The new owner is not responsible for that long delay. So I would ask you to bear in mind that you're just deciding what happens from here on out. You're not saying, well, this property owner is a bad actor, or the person who sold it to them is a bad actor, and therefore we're not going to allow them to do something. It's still the same equation, or the same inequality if you're a math major. Which is greater, the historic preservation interest or the private property interest in this situation?
So Martin, I'm going to have a question on that one. So the public safety, so previous applications we were presented with a public safety issue. The question we asked at the time was a demolition permit being approved and not necessarily remedy the public safety issue, and that's where you use the other tools in the toolbox to address it. So
Right.
I had concerns sometimes that it was being presented as a public safety issue when we didn't really have the tools to adequately. One tool was to approve or not approve a demolition, but that was simply an act that did not compel a particular owner to follow through with the demolition, if that makes sense.
Right. Well, and that's true. And so in those situations where the other tools are, legal tools that are in the hands of the staff in terms of abating a nuisance or, seeking the help of the building official to condemn the property and require whatever action needs to be taken with it. So that's quite true. I mean, if you are looking at, but it goes to the property side of the equation. If the property owner is potentially going to be liable for somebody's injuries, that's a pretty important property interest that he's trying to protect there. So that's not got anything to do with historic preservation, but sure as heck does have something to do with the property interest that you're weighing it against.
Thank you.
Sure. That's the last slide. Wow. Any other questions? I know you have questions.
Could you explain about people who have contracts on a property, but they aren't property owners, and how they are still entitled to file these applications?
So they have to file it in the name of the property owner.
Okay.
The provisions of your town code provide that an application for a certificate of appropriateness has to be approved by the board. It doesn't say who has to file it, but if you don't have ownership interest in the property, you need to have the permission of the actual owner. Just the same as we would for the rezoning application before the Planning Commission, we want to make sure if the person has the ability to do that. Typically, we ask for a power of attorney that's been signed by the property owner authorizing them to apply. But
But
it's not
it
going to
was-
do them any good to get a certificate of appropriateness for that property if they don't own it.
But at the same time, it's different than a rezoning because in a demolition, you cannot consider the future use of the property. You can only consider,
Right. I'm glad you brought that up because, the issue there is that you're going to get another bite at the apple at the ARB. The other bite of the apple, by that I mean in this context, that whoever builds something on that property in the future, whether it's this year, next year, or 10 years from now, is going to have to come in and get a certificate of appropriateness for their new construction. So, you are looking at whether demolition makes sense, weighing property interests versus the historic preservation. Then you're going to have another inequality equation to work, which is going to be, does this plan meet our standards in our guidelines and elsewhere, so that we can say, yes, it rises to the level of being approved, or no, it's just really contrary to our guidelines, and therefore we're not going to approve it. But
Right.
you will have the opportunity to review that at whatever
yes,
time.
but to consider demolition, you cannot consider the future I mean,
Right, I know.
it's just this.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, certificate, the certificate of appropriateness for demolition, your ordinance specifically says that a primary consideration will be the extent to which, it protects irreplaceable historic places or preserves the historic general atmosphere of the town. The rest of the criteria really don't apply to a demolition situation very much. And you don't know. You don't know if this owner is going to be bringing something forward. You don't know if the next owner is going to be bringing something forward. You don't know if it's going to be sold for taxes and you're going to bid it in at the auction and buy it yourselves and use it for public purposes. You just don't know what's going to happen on the property. So I would invite you to put that out of your minds and just focus on the historic preservation issue in that situation.
So it's correct that our current guidelines does have information that's not applicable for today's state.
Yeah, the current guidelines do provide for requiring some kind of plans for what's going to be going on the property. I don't think that's a good idea for a number of reasons, legal reasons as well as reasons of good economic development. But legal reasons are that you are going outside the record that you're trying to create on appropriateness of demolition, and the fact that you really don't know, you really can't bind somebody to those plans because that application is not before you.
But in terms of alternatives that were considered, are those fair questions to ask?
That's alternatives.
Alternatives to the demolition or other remedies or things that they looked at?
Right. So if you have an alternative to the demolition that includes, for example, selling the property to somebody who wants to preserve it, then that's certainly an option. You could say, no, you have the ability to market this property for 12 months at a fair market value to somebody who promises to preserve it. And if nobody comes forward in that 12 months after you've listed it in good faith, you're going to have the right to demolish it anyway. And so we think you ought to do that. And that would then, go back to that's one of your options. And does choosing that option reflect a considered choice from the available options? And if so, can you explain why demolition today is not good, but forcing them to wait 12 months is a good thing? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Martin. Mr. Snyder, to play off of his question in regards to alternatives and what we can and cannot look at, as Vice Mayor stated, we can't look at futuristic plans and ask to see futuristic plans or what a GDP would look like. But when we say, per the guidelines, why alternatives are not considered feasible, if they then bring up their plans stating that, well, their building would be on top of this building or a turn lane would be on top of this building, is that the ability to bring that into, is it feasible or not feasible?
I'm not sure I understand your question. I'm sorry. So what is what feasible or not feasible?
So we cannot say, hey, look, we want to see what your building is going to look like, or you need to submit a GDP. We can't do that.
Right.
But if we're telling them that they need to describe alternatives to demolition and why such alternatives are not considered feasible,
Right.
would one of their reasonings saying, well, it actually does deal with my futuristic plan, and my futuristic plan is this, it's going to be oriented here.
Well, so they can certainly bring whatever evidence, the applicant can bring whatever evidence they want to you, but your consideration is, what are the other alternatives? Would listing the property for sale be feasible? Would renovation of the property now be feasible? And in those situations, you've listened to evidence about whether somebody had the financial wherewithal, which is getting pretty far afield because the property rights don't depend on who owns the property. But you do have the ability to listen to whatever somebody wants to bring forward to you, but I think you need to make your decision based on what are the, when you're weighing the historic preservation against the property interest there. And if the property interest is, I can't do anything with this property with this house on it, I'm going to need to demolish it in order to maintain, to exercise my right to beneficially use this property for profit, then you're going to need to listen to that because that's weighing on this side here on the property rights side.
So what I understood was the latter of your explanation was what are alternatives to demolition, whether adaptive reuse, incorporation into other projects. The council's looking at other alternatives that are there.
Yeah, we talked about moving a house, for
Yeah,
example.
or something like that. I think the challenge is sometimes when those. No, I'm gonna. Thank you.
Okay. There are a lot of challenges. I mean, looking at it from the builder's perspective, they're trying to figure out, I've got this structure on there, and the county assessor thinks it's worth something, but is it actually contributing to the value of this property for me? And that's the way they're looking at it, and it's trying to figure out what they can do with the property. And if they come to the conclusion after looking at it that it's not feasible to preserve, let them present that evidence to you, because that goes again to the property rights side of the equation.
And I apologize, you said economics can or cannot be brought into mix. 'Cause I feel like I've heard difference by reviewing some of the ARB meetings. One of you stated in the January meeting, Mr. Snyder brought up, do you look at the economic factors of it? And you stated that yes, you do look at the economics on the matter. So is it a yes or is it a no in regards to economics on the feasibility?
I don't remember the context of that comment, but
I'll tell you right here. Mr. Snyder says, are we to assess the economics value and the feasibility of the project? And you stated certainly that is one of the issues that you have to decide whether there is a compelling reason to demolish the structure, and the economics are part of that analysis.
right, that's the property value side of things. That is definitely part of it.
But it's the owner's responsibility to present that, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Right. What I was saying a little bit earlier in this meeting was that the property owner's specific lack of funds isn't necessarily a consideration for you because we're talking about property rights, and they still have the property right to sell the property to somebody else who might be able to fix it up. So simply because I am broke doesn't mean that the property should be demolished. Because if you apply that, then every building should be demolished if it's my benefit to do that.
If the board or council recommended for someone to list the home for sale, and then the applicant just didn't want to do that?
Well, they have, then we've been down that road a number of times. So if they don't want to list the property for sale, then we can't force them to.
Okay.
But what happens is that typically the building then starts to deteriorate, and we start looking at the other tools in the toolbox. Do we have the ability to cite them for blight? Do we have the ability to cite them for a danger to the public, that then we can use public funds to go in and fix up the property, preserve the envelopes so the building doesn't fall down, and then let it sit there with a lien on it for the cost of the repairs, and do something about it later on if the lien's not paid off. Those can drag on.
What if they did list the property for sale? How would we know that they did or did not receive offers?
Well, I think if they don't list it under the multiple listing service, then it's going to be difficult to know that. But the provision of the code, it puts the burden on them, puts the burden on the property owner to establish that they've listed applied to the governing body for the right to demolish, and the owner has made a bona fide offer to sell the property, and that no bona fide contract has been executed for the sale of the landmark building or structure prior to the expiration of the time period. So the burden is on the applicant to come back to you and say, here's my MLS listing, here's the packet that I put out on the list, and I have had no offers to purchase it at that price. So the burden's going to be on them to show that. And it's difficult to show a negative, obviously, and it's also difficult for the town to rebut that. But if you do a little bit of research on that, I think you'd probably find out.
So there's no way to know then if they did or did not.
Well, I'm not a real estate agent. We have a real estate agent or two around here. Maybe they can tell.
Well, I'm saying if they, let's say they received an offer, but they didn't accept it for any number of reasons,
Right.
whether they,
Well, then, we would want to know the details of that, because the question is, was it a bona fide contract binding on all the parties, and that was offered? And if they put the building on the market for a certain price, somebody comes back with a reasonable offer, or an offer at the asking price, and maybe they ask for a couple of terms, that's going to be the tricky situation, where if they say, well, I need you to do something for me that wasn't in your listing, can they reject that? We don't have any case law that establishes that, so there's going to be some gray areas. Sir?
thank you.
So for clarification, for instance, the property that's across the street is broken up into multiple parcels.
Right.
Being zoned commercially, it's not going to really be listed on Bright MLS. It's most likely going to be posted on CoStar, LoopNet, one of those things. But also at the same time, with it being a developmental parcel, they're not going to individually list each parcel. It's going to be listed as a whole. So how do you play that off?
Well, so they have, the statute requires that they're selling the landmark building or structure and the land pertaining thereto. It doesn't say it has to be the lot. So again, that's going to be a bit of a gray area, but if you already have it subdivided into lots, that would seem, my argument would be that is the land pertaining thereto. It's the lot that it's sitting on.
Yeah, that'd be fair.
Hey, Martin, question, we have several properties. How does the condition play into this? It just seems like there should be more of a, it meets 4 out of the 5. If it needs a roof, it needs a foundation, it needs this or whatever. And we have this on multiple properties that how does the condition, once they get so blighted, that yes, you could replace anything at a cost.
Right.
But where does that fall under, as far as
Well,
the town, as we see these conditions on a lot of these properties?
Right. So in the first instance, where somebody comes in and applies for a certificate of appropriateness, you're weighing their property rights against the historic preservation value. And so if they say, I'm going to have to put a new roof on, I'm going to have to gut the house, I'm going to have to jack up the foundation, put a new foundation under it, and it's going to cost me X, then that's something you should take into consideration. All right? And that's because you're weighing that against the historic preservation issue. But again, they may not have those figures, and it may not make that much difference. If it was George Washington's boyhood home, we're going to preserve that. Somebody's going to want to preserve that. If it's just another example of a 1950s style Rambler, it's going to weigh a little less on the historic preservation side. So you're basically weighing those interests, which don't have a direct equivalent. And once the historic building's gone, it's gone forever. So that kind of weighing is very difficult to do, because you're dealing with a very abstract thing against something that's very concrete in terms of, I did the math and it's going to cost me $100,000 to repair this building. So it's always a difficult task to try to do that weighing, and the applicant always comes in with some figures. And I've seen them come in with an engineer's report that says the property is completely unrepairable. You'd have to rip out everything and replace it, every wood board, and then somebody comes along and buys it. So it happens. Yeah.
It's happened in town.
Yeah. So,
So but I guess back to the question, there's no criteria out there, there's nothing that
there's
shows.
no bright line test.
Right.
This is
of
all
how many
of the weighing
components have
balancing.
to, it's an individual assessment and then an opinion based on all the information
Right.
that individual gathered.
Right. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
So to a degree,
So to a degree, if the applicant were to bring in an economic argument, then that's something that we can take into account when we make our decision?
You can take that into account, because
Okay.
you're weighing their property interests against the historic preservation.
But I think we have the ability to ask questions about that.
You do, yeah. Look behind that, you're not required to take it at face value. You could say, well, who's this person? What are their qualifications? You've got a report, but I don't see the person's resume attached to it.
I guess I would look at the condition in terms of the criteria of those things. I would say the town has not always had all the tools in place.
Right.
Now that we have all the tools, we can remedy those things so they don't continue to happen.
Correct, and one of the big tools is that you now have $50,000 in the budget for blight remediation, and so you have the ability to say, well, this, we prioritize this building for that blight remediation because if it's gone, then that's going to seriously impact the preservation of irreplaceable historic places or general historic atmosphere of the town, and those are the criteria you're looking at.
Martin, I know we're going late, but I do have one question if it's within your purview. So the specific nexus or impetus for this training was a statement that we had inappropriate behavior during a recess, and it referred to recommended training on a number of subjects.
Uh-huh.
Is there an ability to provide us some more specific? It seems like we, outside that recess, generally followed some of the provisions you've marked here. Is there a way to describe what that inappropriate behavior was so we can make this training more effective?
Yeah, the inappropriate behavior, as I understand it, if it's all right for me to go into this, is the discussion during the recess, and that you're having a discussion where multiple people can hear. You ask the question, are the mics off, which just doesn't look very good. The important thing there to recall is that we want to turn, as they say in the Army, turn square corners. We want to make sure that we're not just abiding by the letter of the law, but also by the spirit of it. And so that's important to be seen by the public that we are honoring FOIA exactly. Okay? Make sense?
So it was a general, not that it was necessarily any violation per se, it was just generally recommended that we be more mindful of our discussions.
Well, we're in public session, so I'm never going to say that you violated any law.
Okay.
But-
In terms of asking, I can defend later my comment about asking if the mics were off.
Yeah, I-
Protocols of recess. Okay, well, I appreciate your feedback.
Sure.
One question. Regardless whether you're in recess or not, 3 people, that's a meeting,
That's correct.
and you're discussing
And
town business.
Right, and discussing can be one person talking, could be none of the members talking, but they're all listening to the same staff member at the same time. Remember that that's
Thank you.
got to avoid that.
So Emily did come, I think she did the right thing, came and separated us, but I guess the point is, the rest of us were within hearing range?
It's in hearing range, correct.
Okay,
Yeah,
thanks.
That's the problem.
However, one-on-one, we can have a conversation as private citizens as well.
You can have, as a member of the ARB, you can have a conversation with a private citizen. You just need, during a recess, you need to step away
I
from the
meant
time.
with each other, say, Matt, we step away and have a private conversation about public matter. Is that
As long as the two of you are having that discussion away from other members of the body, yeah, you can do that. So just
That's
be out of
leave
your
the dais. The moral of the story is, leave the dais, outside
Right.
bar.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
all groups can learn from that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Okay. Anything else? Appreciate your time and attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.